Let's unscramble eggs and heart disease. Let's talk about why the confusion, what are the facts, and where to from here. Well, my name is Dr. Warwick Bishop. I'm a cardiologist. In fact, I'm a preventative cardiologist with an interest in stopping people having heart attacks. Well, where did this cholesterol controversy all start? Well, somewhere around the early 1900s, two Russian researchers started to feed rabbits a cholesterol-enriched diet. Well, this led to plaque building up in the arteries. Now, no one actually asked the question, do rabbits normally eat cholesterol? But nonetheless, this started a concept around cholesterol we eat ending up in the arteries. Some 50 years later, Ansel Keys, in the very well-known 7-country study, showed a link between dietary cholesterol, blood cholesterol levels, and increased risk of heart attack. Soon after, in actual fact, Dwight Eisenhower, while in office as President of the United States of America, had a heart attack. Well, you can imagine this really put focus onto coronary artery disease. Soon after, the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association started to really become involved and put out early guidelines in regard to diet and cholesterol and heart disease. This was really the beginning of the cholesterol hypothesis, and we saw in the 1980s that Time magazine actually reflected some of the feelings of the medical community and general population with a cover on Time magazine suggesting that cholesterol was bad. Well, the 1990s saw the beginning of the statin trials, and this confirmed that lowering cholesterol in high-risk individuals did in fact reduce risk of heart attack. But we've known for years humans and our ancestors have eaten eggs without a problem. So what's really going on? Well, we know that an egg needs to have all the constituents for a full chicken, a full organism, to be produced. And part of that is cholesterol, and that's needed for every cell in our body to keep it flexible and have it working properly. We know that that cholesterol is also needed for brain function and wraps around the nerves to help conduction of electricity. We know that cholesterol is important for vitamin D. We know it's important for hormone production, and we know it's also important for bile acid formation, and these are all things we need as well. Well, when we think about eggs and we think about food and cholesterol, how much cholesterol actually is in an egg? Well, your average egg is about 60 grams, and the amount of cholesterol in it is less than 250 milligrams, and it's not the highest food with cholesterol that we know. If you want to try and put 250 milligrams into context, take a single A4 sheet of paper, cut it into 20 equal pieces, and one of those pieces will be about 250 milligrams, so not a lot. But it's really important to remember that the cholesterol we eat, whether that's through eggs or other sources, doesn't just end up in the body as cholesterol floating around in the bloodstream. It's transported in these extremely complicated protein-rich balls called lipoproteins. So, is that confusing? Well, of course it is, because when we look even clinically at people with raised cholesterol, sometimes we see those people have bad coronary arteries. But we also see people with raised cholesterol have surprisingly good coronary arteries. And yet equally, we see people with low cholesterol levels with good coronary arteries, but surprisingly, at times we see people with low cholesterol and bad coronary arteries, and hence a real conundrum of confusion. We do know, however, if we identify people with high risk, people who have had a heart attack or a stroke or needed a stent or bypass, if we lower their cholesterol, regardless of whether it's from a high point or a low point, we can reduce their risk of future event. So what does happen when we eat cholesterol? Well, it turns out there are specialised, dedicated cholesterol receptors within the gut. They absorb the cholesterol into the cells that line the gut, put that cholesterol through a very clever process and spit out a little transport ball, vesicle, or a lipoprotein that then transports that cholesterol through the body. Remember, cholesterol has to be transported because it's a fat, and a fat would float to the surface of our blood because our blood's basically water. We can't have fat floating to the top because if we stood up, we'd have cholesterol in our brains unprotected from the surrounds. But what happens with cholesterol that we eat, and what happens in the body? And does the body produce cholesterol? Well, it does. Almost every cell in the body can. And here's the really interesting thing. Within almost every cell in the body is this SREBP2 protein complex, which acts as a balance mechanism, a homeostatic mechanism, dictating how much cholesterol an individual cell makes. That particular mechanism recognizes if we eat more cholesterol, it then means the body produces less of its own. And it also means if we eat less cholesterol, the body produces more of its own. Well, what dictates where that is? It's dictated by your parents. It's genetic. But it is interesting to know, and it's important to understand, that cholesterol of its own is really fairly neutral in terms of its impact on the so-called bad cholesterol that we measure in the bloodstream. What does happen though is if we consume saturated fats, these alter that balance mechanism and in fact raise total body so-called bad LDL cholesterol. So where does that leave us? Well, it turns out that cholesterol consumption and what ends up in the blood is far more complicated than what we've ever thought. Your cholesterol levels, your so-called LDL cholesterol levels, are set by your genetics. The LDL cholesterol levels, if they're associated with high-risk plaque or someone who's had a heart attack, if they're lowered, they will benefit people. There's no question about that. But eating cholesterol of its own has little impact on your so-called bad cholesterol. What has more of an impact is saturated fats. Eggs tend to be LDL neutral, so they don't really change it. And indeed, when we think about eggs and our health, our times have changed. In fact, the Heart Foundation of Australia now have no limit on egg consumption for the average healthy individual, and in fact, even in high-risk individuals, support one egg being consumed on a daily basis. Well, this is a really nice reassurance, and it's a good reassurance for our population who enjoy their eggs. Now, what's in eggs? Over and above cholesterol, we touched on the role of cholesterol, but super important to realise that there are things like choline, folate, antioxidants, and a wonderful source of protein in eggs. And this is important because particularly for children as they grow, and particularly for the elderly as they may be looking for nutritional sources to maintain their strength, eggs could be the answer. So indeed, an egg a day may well keep the doctor away. Don't forget, Humpty Dumpty died from osteoporosis, not cardiovascular disease. And I'd like to thank you for sharing your time.